Kiddushin Daf Amud Bet. The things we fear, Eihu Miβa'it nafshia. If you've been listening to the Matmonim every single day for nearly 3 years, and this is the only shiur you understand, it will have been worth it. Because of the importance of what we're going to learn today and its application in our lives, particularly at the times in which we find ourselves. We're going to learn that faith, bitachon, does not give us license to abandon the responsibility to invest effort in our lives and to strategize for success. We have to do that. That's ishtadlut. But what bitachon does deny is the place for the emotion of fear. Because in an animal, fear is an involuntary reflex reaction to threat. But in a human being, that isn't so. In a human being, fear is a choice. We're never harmed by the things we fear. We're harmed by fear itself. That we see in our sugya, in our piece of Gemara. Gemara is dealing with the various ways in which assaulting a slave can result in his freedom. The shein v'ayin, the idea of the tooth and the eye, and from that this whole piece of Gemara learns the various conditions under which an assault gives a slave his freedom. In the process, the Gemara says, what happens if the damage caused to the slave is not visible? So, for example, you hit his eye or his ear and you caused blindness or deafness. So the slave looks at it, all right, there's no visible difference in the slave, but he's lost his senses. Eved yotzei bahen lecherut, he goes out to freedom. However, neged eino ve'eino ro'eh, keneged ozno ve'eino shomea. If you shoot a blank bullet and make a terrible noise next to his ear or his eye, or you bang on the side of a wall, so you haven't touched the eved, but you blind him or you deafen him because of the sound, because of the noise, ein eved yotzei bahem lecherut. Then the eved doesn't go out. Omer Rav Shimon Rav Ashi, the memra dekala lav klumu. Are you suggesting that damaging with sound is not damage? An advanced piece of Gemara. We don't have time to go into this piece of it, but looking at sound waves. Are sound waves physical things that cause damage? And is a person responsible? Are you suggesting that sound is not tangible damage? Didn't we learn Tanagol Shoshit Rosho La'avir Klei Zkuchit V'Takabo V'Shuvaro Mishalem Nezik Shalem V'Omer Rav Yosef Omer Rav Beirav Sus Shetzanav V'Chamosh Shanav V'Shibru Kelim B'Toch HaBayit Mishalmim Chatzi Nezek. We've got cases where if animals make a noise, it can be a bird, a chicken puts its neck into a bottle and it crows and shatters the bottle. It's just one of those sound waves that cause damage. Or another animal, a donkey, an ox, and they cause damage. You're liable. We've got Gemaras for that, where you have to pay. So you see that sound is an instrument of potential damage, and the person initiating the sound is surely responsible for that damage. Amale shani adam, don't bring me proofs from animals. When animals do that, then yes, the owner is responsible. But an Adam, the kivan, the bardatu, an Adam, a human being has choice. A human being has knowledge. A human being has understanding. Eihu miβa'it nafshia. He caused his own fear. Wow. Even if the person gets blinded or deafened, he is responsible because of his reaction to the noise, his reaction to the shock. Kiddetanya, as we've learned in the Braita, we've got a parallel Gemara in Bava Kama, Daf Tzadi Aleph and Daf Tzadi Chet. Hamav'it et chaviro patu midinei adam v'chayiv b'dinei shamayim. If you cause a person shock, there's no responsibility in a court of law, but medinei shamayim, Hashem holds you accountable. Ketzad, for example, takabos no v'chashor patur. If you blew a sound at his ear, you made a terrible noise next to his ear and made him deaf, patur, you are not responsible in a court of law. Bidine de grama, you caused it indirectly. Hashem will take responsibility. Will hold you responsible, but a court of law won't. If you held him and you made that sound into his ear, then you would be chayav. Why is an adam the badat? Who says Rashi? Hai nizak v'chi mevayit midate ka mevayit. He caused it. Noten libo el pachad kol haba pitom. Even though the sound came suddenly, he applied his heart, he allowed himself to be shocked. It's unbelievable. Shock is a choice. Fear is a choice. You have a moment, you have a fraction of a second when something happens to choose not to react. We always have that fraction of a second. There's a pause, there's a moment between a stimulus and a response, as Viktor Frankl says. And in that response, he says, lies our freedom, because we can choose how to respond. But what he doesn't say clearly is what the Gemara says here, that even shock and fear, just take a moment and breathe and align yourself to bitachon, and there's no need for fear. You can't control the event, but you can control your response to it. And even something which we consider as involuntary as fear is involuntary only for animals, but not for humans. Humans can make the choice. And the Netziv in the Murim Esodeh proves from the Gemara in Daf Tzadi Aleph that the reason that you're not chayav over here is not because sound is not serious. Sound is an instrument of distraction. The Gemara concludes, the Netziv says, the whole issue is because havihu gorem ledavar, is because he caused his own damage. This is not the shocker that caused the damage, it's the shocked that caused the damage. Unbelievable chiddush in the Gemara. And we're learning, the purpose of Matmonim is, I'm not just giving you a theory, I'm showing you how to learn this out of the Gemara, out of the Torah Shebaal Peh that was given to us on Sinai by the Ribono Shel Olam and handed down to us for 3,000 years, generation to generation, Rebbe to Talmud. This is how Hashem built the world. This is how Hashem designed the world. This is not some psychological fad that somebody's put out all of a sudden. This is Hashem telling us, this is our Chazal telling us, this is how the world works. And Eov says, there's a pasuk, Ki pachadati vaye'etayuni. I was afraid, I had fear, and what I feared came to me. Says the Gemara in Brochus. There was a Talmud that was walking behind Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi in the marketplace of Tzion, and Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi noticed that this young man was afraid, he had fear. Omale, what did he say to him? Chatoat, you're a sinner, you're not allowed to be scared. Yes, you've got to do things, you've got to take action. But the emotion of fear is chato. Where does he get this from? We'll see. It's a chait. When you come to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, when you come to Yom Kippur now, to Slichas on Motzei Shabbos, and you say al chait, one of the al chaits for us to say is that we were afraid, that there were times when we were scared, because that's a chait. Dichtiv pachadu b'tzion chataim. Amale, so the student says to him, V'aktiv ashrei adam b'fached tamid. There's a pasuk that says you should always be afraid. You should always be afraid that you haven't learnt enough. You should always be afraid that you didn't understand the Chazal properly. You should always be afraid that the Matmonim you happen to miss. Exactly, this happens to be this Matmonim today, and you didn't learn one of the most important lessons in your life. That's something to be afraid of, to tremble about. But to be afraid of people, that's not. There's no place for that. Yehuda bar Nosson Avashaki Vazil Basri Rav Hamnuna. Rav Yehuda bar Nosson was busy talking in Torah and he was following Rav Hamnuna Itnach. And he gave a krechts. Amale Yisurim boy how gavli to nafshi. Do you want to attract tzoros? A krechts is not a response to tzorah. A krechts is a magnet for tzoros. What a principle. What an idea. A krechts is not a reaction to tzoros, it's not a reaction to trouble. A krechts, a sigh, attracts the trouble. I often say losers attract loss. What is a loser? A loser is a person who's always krechtzing. Oh, things are terrible things. That attracts it. The law of attraction doesn't only work for good things, the law of attraction also works for negative things. This pasuk in Eov. The same thing. And we learned this in Parashat Shoftim, we read it just recently. That if you go to war, lo tira mehem, you're not allowed to be afraid of them. This is even in wartime. What do you mean you're not allowed to be afraid? I'm afraid. Fear is a choice. You're not an animal. Animals are afraid when there's trouble. Human beings can choose. The antidote to fear is bitachon. I've got to prepare for war. I've got to go to war. I've got to strategize for war. But I may not fear loss. And so on. You should say to them, Al yerach levavchem, al tiru, v'al tachbesu, v'al tartzu mipnehem. These are isurim. Moshe warns the people, you're not permitted to fear. And then the Shotrim say it, eventually, and anybody who is afraid should go home. Why should he go home? So that he doesn't infect other people with fear. Not only is fear a choice to destroy your life, fear is a choice to infect the people around you with the destructive force of fear. Fear is infectious. And so not only are you, we've talked about how the news media spread Lashon Hara and by exposing oneself to it, one's over in Isur, the news media also spread fear because they make money out of fear. And to buy into that fear, one's over Isurim Doraisa, as the Rambam paskins. Kol hamatchil lachshov ulaharer b'milchama umavhil atzmo. Look at the Rambam's words. Anybody who begins to think in war, umavhil atzmo, and makes himself shocked. Doesn't mean say who become shocked. Who mavhil atzmo. We make ourselves shock. Over b'lo taseh. That's an Isur Doraisa. It's a transgression of the Torah. Shneimar al yerach levavchem v'lo od shekol damei Yisrael tluyim b'tzavaro. The lost blood of Israel is on his head because of the fear he transmitted. During COVID time, we got very angry if people were careless and they were transmitting the virus. But do we get angry when people transmit the fear virus? That's even more serious. People die from fear. What right have you got to transmit the fear of the virus of fear? If you didn't win and fight with all of your effort, it's as if you murdered your fellow soldiers with your fear. And Rabbeinu Bechaya, this is Rabbeinu Bechaya ben Asher, not the Rabbeinu Bechaya who wrote the Chovas Halvovos, the Rabbeinu Bechaya who wrote the Perush on Chumash, Talmud of the Rashbo, the school of the Ramban, and he writes the same thing, that from these psukim, the very fear is not only a sin, but it creates the stumbling, it creates the thing that destroys. Your fear strengthens the enemy. Because we're not allowed to be afraid of other human beings. That's not something we're allowed to do. The Beis Halevi, it's Reb Chaim Soloveitchik's father, the great Beis Halevi, just one of the foundational achronim that is one of our most important works. Beis Halevi, careful with every word that he says, wrote a sefer which I only saw in our Beis HaMedrash on Shabbos, a gem of a sefer, a Ma'amar HaBitachon. He wrote a sefer about Bitochen. And look through a few of the things that he says. Avera zu choser bitachon, this avera of not having bitachon, gorem lo lipol, that causes the fall. That causes the failure. Failure is caused by fear. The fear of failure is what causes it. Again, if the fear drives you to do something about it, that's fine. To act is fine, but to feel, to be locked in fear is an issur. Because if a person is afraid, that will create the space for a destructive force that wasn't there before. You create your own destructive forces. One could just sit on this piece of Torah for months and understand it and apply it. If you were afraid, there's an Isur Doraisa. He gives a new pshat. Why does the person who is afraid have to go home? Because your fear will cause the very thing you're afraid of. Rather go home. You can't fight with fear. If you're afraid of losing, or you're afraid of dying, or you're afraid of being wounded, you will die, you will be wounded. So rather go home, protect yourself. But the Torah doesn't just say the reason that he must go home is to protect himself. The Torah says also, "V'lo yimased levavechav kil vavo," so as not to spread and infect other people with that fear. What does that mean? Yes, fear is the issue. By being afraid, you can bring about harm to yourself. But you can also, it's an infectious thing, this fear. It's an emotion that causes the spread of emotions. All emotions are infectious, by the way. That the researchers have proved already. Every emotion is infectious to some degree. But fear is hyper-infectious. We see that in the Hoshanas. In the Hoshanas of Hoshana Rabbah, the one that starts Adamame Ere, There's a whole list of plagues. Save the olive trees from shedding, and the wheat from locusts, and the produce from insects, and the vine vats from grasshoppers, and the vineyards from worms, and so on. And then it says, nefesh mi behala, and save the soul from shock. Why is that put in together with all the plagues? Because fear can become a plague. A community can be plagued with fear. A nation can be plagued with fear. Civilization can be plagued with fear. And we say on Hoshana Rabbah, if this is the only one we say this Hoshana Rabbah, if you just focus on this one Hoshana, nefesh mi behala, not to allow us to become plagued with fear. So we see that not only is fear something that we choose for ourselves, chas v'sholem, but when we choose fear, we're choosing it for our whole community. We're choosing to spread it. We're choosing to infect people with fear. And that's a chait. We see that's an isur d'oraisa. To fear is an isur d'oraisa. And more than that, as we see from the Rishonim and from the Beis Halevi, fear in itself becomes the creator and the initiator of the very thing we fear. Because we're never damaged by the things we fear. We're damaged by fear itself.